So what we're going to be doing in this lesson is using something called the order of operations to evaluate algebraic expressions. I think this should be pretty straightforward, should be a review for you guys. I think you've seen order of operations probably a number of times in the past. I'm sure you have all sorts of different mnemonic devices to remember. We're going to walk through, we're going to write the steps in normal English phrases here, and then talk about some mnemonic devices and look at a couple of example problems. Okay, so some new vocabulary that you should be aware of. Variables, if you recall, they represent unknown quantities, things like x, y, and z. Algebraic expressions are expressions that contain variables, algebraic things, not just numerical things. Order of operations we are about to learn about, and formulas will come in your next section, your next note section from 1.1. All right, so order of operations, like I said, we're going to write them out in plain English and then talk about little tricky, easy ways to remember them. Okay, order of operations, step number 1 is to evaluate expressions inside grouping symbols. Okay, so here we use the phrase grouping symbols instead of just saying parentheses. I'm sure you're used to the first step being parentheses, but we could also have things like brackets, parentheses inside of parentheses, things like that. And then technically, if you have a quotient, grouping the numerator versus grouping the denominator is also considered to be a grouping symbol. So we're kind of advancing that step and calling it grouping symbols. Next step, evaluate all powers. Now, powers would be something like you see down here. That's the third power, also known as exponents. Step 3, multiply and or divide, whichever you need to do. From left to right. Now you may need to multiply, you may need to divide, you may need to do both. Some things that people forget about, you don't do all the multiplication first, then all the division. You kind of do them as one joint step, but you move from left to right. That's the important part right here. And then final step, very similar to step 3, we add and or subtract from left to right. Okay, so what I'm sure many of you remember is the acronym PEMDAS. You may have just said that, like just the made-up word that comes from those kind of 6 steps. So P stands for parentheses, but remember we talked about advancing it to grouping symbols. E stands for exponents, aka powers, multiply and divide from left to right, and then add or subtract from left to right. You might also remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. You probably did that. My husband claims he remembered it as Patrick Ewing's mom does awesome slams. I don't know if that's relevant to you at all. Patrick Ewing was a basketball star in the 90s. Many of you were born in the late 90s, but you've got many options there to remember the order of operations. PEMDAS probably being the easiest one. So we're just going to go through a couple of quick examples here. This first example, we're going to evaluate this algebraic expression by subbing in these options for x and for y. Okay, so I'm going to color code to hopefully make things easier for you. So we've got x equals 1, and then we have y equals 4. So we're going into this expression right here, and then like I said, every time you see an x, you're going to replace it with a 1. Every time you see a y, you're going to replace it with a 4. So instead of x minus y, we are going to plug in a 1 for x, and then minus a 4 for y. And then we've got this little exponent on the outside, and then don't forget about this plus 3 after all of that. Okay, so we're going to follow the order of operations here. So first, evaluate the expressions inside grouping symbols. That means we're doing this first. We're inside parentheses. 1 minus 4, you do that subtraction first, and we're going to end up with a negative 3. and then there's a third power on the outside, plus 3, so lots of 3's here. Step 2, evaluate all powers. So this power on the outside, the third power means you multiply this by itself 3 times. So -3 times -3 times -3. So if we just do 2 of them, -3 times -3 is +9, and then if we multiply times a -3 again, we end up with -27. All right, and then again, still don't forget about that plus 3. Multiply or divide from left to right, there's no multiplication or division, so we jump to step 4, add or subtract from left to right. So we're going to add -27 plus 3, and so we end up with a -24. All right, so that would be your final answer. Now, if you had done things in a different order, you wouldn't have gotten the same answer, which is why it's so important to have this order of operations. Okay, next example here. Example 2, we've got part A and part B. So all of these, we've got n's and t's. We're going to replace them with these values right here. So I will color code again. Okay, so n is 2, and then minus t is a 3.4. And then in parentheses, we've got n squared, so 2 squared minus t, which is 3.4. Okay, so we start with anything inside of grouping symbols, so that would be this right here. Now notice we've got a bunch of stuff happening inside the grouping symbols. So once you're inside, parentheses, brackets, whatever, order of operations kind of starts over again. So we'd start with this exponent. So I'm just going to rewrite all of these. So 2 squared, 2 times 2 is 4. And then we're still kind of on step 1 because we need to do this step right here. So I'm going to transfer it up over here. So 4 minus 3.4 is 0.6. Okay, now next step is exponents or powers. We don't have any of those. And then next is multiplying or dividing. This is technically multiplication. The 3.4 outside of the 0.6 technically means that you're supposed to be multiplying those together. Now we're dealing with decimals, so if you can multiply that in your head, great. I'd prefer that you are at least practicing some simple skills like this and not just jumping right to your calculator. All right, so remember how to do some of these things. So 2 decimal places like this means we move 2 decimal places at the end. So that is actually a 2.04. So that's step 3, multiply or divide. Last step is to either add or subtract. So we do 2 minus 2.04. That leaves us with a negative 0.04. So that is your final answer. Okay, and our last one right here, part B, we've got 3 different variables. I think I'm going to skip the color coding if you don't mind. We've got 8xy, so we start with 8, which is just there. X, we sub in a 5, x equals 5 right here. Y, we're going to sub in a -2, that's our second variable, plus z cubed, so sub in a -1 for z, and then we've got the cubed on the outside, all of that over y squared, so -2 squared plus 5. Okay, so step 1 is grouping symbols. Like I said before, the numerator and denominator kind of being separated out like that, that's technically a grouping symbol. So we go within this right here, start with the first step, which is going to be the exponent. So we're not even touching that first part at all. And then -1 cubed is -1 times -1, which is +1, and then times a -1 again, which is -1. So now we can also start to simplify this. -2 squared is -2 times itself, which is +4. Okay, keep on simplifying. Next, we're going to multiply from left to right. So we're going to multiply all these together. So 8 times 5, that's 40. And then times -2 gives us a -80 plus a -1. And then over 4 plus 5. So finally, we work on the addition and subtraction. So we've got -80 plus a -1. That's a -81. 4 plus 5 is 9. So now last, we do have to kind of simplify this up here because -81 divided by 9 is able to be simplified. So -81 over 9 reduces down to -9. Okay, all set on that first part.